Now we're going to shift gears completely for a while, and we're going to talk about intellectual history, philosophical history, and the ideas that I'm going to be talking about in this section are extremely important. They're extremely important for this class and for the exam, obviously, but they're extremely important for understanding the concepts on which the United States was established in the 18th century. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. Now, before we talk about the Enlightenment, let's talk briefly about what came before it, because as you look at in Western society these kind of shifts back and forth in ideas, oftentimes one period is a reaction to the one before it. So before the Enlightenment, and by the way, the Enlightenment started in the mid to late 17th century and was well underway by 1700 and essentially lasted throughout that whole next century, the whole 18th century. So before that was an era that is sometimes called by historians the Age of Faith, an era in which religion was extraordinarily important. That really it started, or it reached its early peak, I guess, with the Protestant Reformation, and we've talked about that briefly. That was there in the 1500s, the early 1500s, when the German priest Martin Luther protested against the practice of selling indulgences by the Catholic Church, and that sort of mushroomed into him breaking away from the Catholic Church and starting a different brand of Christianity, and then various other people throughout Europe doing the same thing, and they were called Protestants, and there were a lot of different kinds of them, right? So there's Lutherans, not surprisingly. Anabaptists, who went on to become Mennonites and Amish, Methodists, Anglican, so on and so forth. And when all that happened in Europe, it really sparked a huge overall war, a period of great wars. Now, before the Protestant Reformation, in the medieval period, when people identified, I mentioned this before, not by race or by nationality, although they might identify themselves as subject of a certain king, but primarily they identified as, by their religion. So it was Christians versus Muslims. Now, with the advent of the Reformation, it is one kind of Christian against the other kinds of Christians. So Catholic against Protestant. And there were a lot of wars that at their heart stemmed from that division. And then there would also be some wars that stemmed from one Protestant group opposing another Protestant group. So by the mid to late 1600s, there had been roughly a century and a half of bloody warfare, some individual wars between European powers lasting for decades, and that is going to serve as a prompt for the shift in the other direction that occurs. The shift toward the Age of Reason, when people, particularly educated people in the Western world, in Europe, and by extension in the colonies, viewed themselves as becoming more enlightened rather than being in the darkness of superstition or the darkness of blind faith in a particular church or institution which had not served people well, because that blind faith had led to people just slaughtering each other, right? So, some of the early sparks of the Enlightenment, some early prominent individuals in the late 1600s, included people like the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who was of Portuguese Jewish descent and was a Dutch citizen. The English scientist and philosopher Francis Bacon, who is not the same person as Nathaniel Bacon. Different Bacons. This is Francis Bacon, who is known as the father of empiricism, or the father of the scientific method, which I'm sure almost all of you hopefully are familiar with, right? And the scientific method really is a good way to describe the Enlightenment. Instead of believing something because a member of the clergy told you to, instead of that, or because tradition says so, the scientific method, and these philosophers and scientists, and sometimes they were both, of the Enlightenment, believe that you should rely on empirical data. You should rely upon the evidence of your senses. So if there's something that cannot be perceived in the natural world, something supernatural, well then that's left out of the discussion. So in order to understand things, you come up with a hypothesis as to why things are a certain way, and then you test your hypothesis by doing experiments, and then you collect the data from your experiments, compare them to your hypothesis, and see whether it was correct. And if it is not, then you toss that hypothesis out and come up with a different one and keep trying. Reliance on the mind and on reason, not on faith. Well, Francis Bacon, also Sir Isaac Newton in England, a subject of much gravity, and the philosopher John Locke from England, who talked a lot about the social contract, and we will go into more detail about that in just a minute. So those were some of the prominent early people. By the 1700s, the Enlightenment was centered in France. Now, it existed throughout Europe and the colonies of the European powers, but a lot of the big stuff that was happening in the 1700s was happening in France, including, for example, Denis Diderot, who was the person who sort of helped put together the encyclopédie, the encyclopedia, first encyclopedia. The philosopher Voltaire, very, very prominent thinker, and the philosopher Montesquieu, who introduced the idea of the separation of powers. Okay, so in the medieval period, people believed in the divine right of kings. And we sort of talked about that a little bit, the very first introductory lecture to this class, which is kind of similar to the idea of the mandate of heaven in Chinese culture and history. So the king is the king because he's the king, and if God didn't want him to be king, he wouldn't be king, so you have to do what he says because he's the king, because God wants him to be. That's how that argument went, which works out really well if you happen to be the king. But and again, this could be an entire semester-long course just talking about the transition from that to the thought that came after it, with things like the Magna Carta about 300 or 400 years before the period we're talking about. But basically, the concepts were that there's the monarchy. This is how it existed before. The monarchy is in control, and then there's everybody else. And the everybody else in Western culture had been divided into three groups: the clergy, the aristocracy, and the common people. Aristocracy also being, the nobility, the dukes and counts and lords and knights and all that stuff. Well, Montesquieu, who was living in a monarchy in France at the time, Montesquieu divided government into basically two different kinds of government. There was the monarchy itself, but then there was also the administrative part of the government. And instead of saying that, the three parts of government are the clergy, the aristocracy, and the people, he said that the three different types of administrative government are the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. And he proposed that these three aspects of administrative government sort of had to be in balance and needed to be set up in such a way that they offset one another, so that no one of those three could become more powerful than the other two. Does that sound vaguely familiar? If not, it should by the time we get through this course, because those ideas are going to be very influential on some of the college-educated people in the English colonies in North America. Names that we haven't mentioned yet, but will later, like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. All right. Well, like I said, this was all kind of a reaction against the religious wars. I got a quote here from 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, who called it mankind's final coming of age, the emancipation of the human consciousness from an immature state of ignorance and error. So, on the surface, sounds like this is cold, rational logic, and it is sort of in opposition to religion. That's what it sounds like, because it's like different from blind faith, right? But it's really not in opposition to religion. The Enlightenment affected religion, particularly the established religions of the time. Things are going to get kind of disrupted in a few decades from here when the Great Awakening starts. But basically, one of the tenets of the Enlightenment that takes hold in religion is the tenet of Arminianism, which is kind of the opposite of Calvinism. And we talked about Calvinism, John Calvin, and in particular the idea of predestination. Remember, the Puritans were really big on that. Predestination. God knows what is going to happen to you, and it is set in stone, and it cannot be changed. You just don't know what it is. Arminianism says that, on the contrary, your future is mutable. It can be changed. And the reason it can be changed is that God gifted humans with free will and with reason. So free will. He did not want humans to worship him because they were programmed to, or because they were destined to. He gave them the choice. That's the whole thing with Adam and Eve and the apple, right? So free will. And your free will has consequences. Arminianists would say that if you make a decision to turn around, to repent, to change the trajectory that you're on, that can, save you from hell and guide you toward heaven. And far from being in opposition to in the Enlightenment, to logic, this approach it adds logic and reason to religion, because it says that reason is a gift from God, that the ability to think things through, to use your mind and figure out what's logical, that is a gift God gave you to help you make the right decisions, and then he gave you the free will to follow through or not. So this has an effect on religious approach. So some of the new denominations that will arise in the 1700s take this approach. Now, another Protestant approach that became somewhat prominent in the 1700s is called Deism. Many of the quote-unquote founding fathers were deists. Now, whenever I have this question on an exam and I ask people to say, what is deism? There's always people that say, a religion that believes in a God. No, that's not right. It's a lot more complicated than that. Deism is a belief in God, but totally different from the approaches that most Christians had taken of thinking that God is right there directing events and all decisions have to be left up, given over to him. And a good way to describe it, and the way that it has been described, and maybe you've heard about it this way, is the concept of the clockwork universe. Basically, in this version of Christianity, God and the universe can be explained by comparing it all to a clockmaker. So, a clockmaker, a watchmaker, the internal mechanisms of those devices are carefully calibrated. Gears, and springs, and mechanisms that once you wind the whole thing up, then it will work, well, like clockwork. So how that translates into the deist's view of God and Christianity is that there is a God, there is a creator who created the universe, including humans, but essentially created the universe, very carefully calibrated it, and set everything in motion so that it would run, basically, on its own, and then stepped back and is letting it run. So, in other words, God created the universe, but is not directly involved day to day in the affairs of humankind. So, what that means is that humans, even acknowledging a creator, that humans, from this viewpoint, have to solve their own problems. And that essentially, and this is a very Enlightenment way of looking at things, essentially God, as the clockmaker, gave humans the ability to use logic and turned them loose. Using logic, therefore, is the God-directed thing to do. So instead of doing what people had been doing in Western civilization for many centuries, which is pray and also seek the intercession of clergy or whatever to get God to be involved, just kind of take for granted that God's put everything in motion, and now we're on our own. And it is God's will that we figure it all out. So this was, like I said, a fairly common belief among those who are referred to now as the Founding Fathers. Quite a few of them, in fact. So when you read something from those Founding Fathers or other people who were alive and writing during the Enlightenment, very frequently when they're talking about God, the Almighty, the Creator, and so forth, they're not calling for intercession from God. They're not calling for any particular special relationship with God. They're acknowledging that God created everything, but that essentially it's now up to us. Right before the beginning of the Enlightenment in England, England had gone through some pretty rocky times, as we have discussed specifically in the 1640s, the English Civil War, which, as you will recall, had started off as a war between the Cavaliers, the aristocrats who supported the king, and the Roundheads, or the Puritans. So another way of looking at that is a war between people who believe that the king and aristocrats should be able to tell everyone what to do, and another side that believed that the church should be able to tell everyone what to do. And so they kind of fought over that, and it got pretty ugly. Well, once things kind of had returned to previous forms, as far as the monarchy being restored after that period, by the early 1700s, kind of as a result, really, a side effect of that severe social disruption of the mid-17th century, there was more and more of a focus in England on liberty. Liberty and the liberty of the individual freedom. Also, newer ideas like this balance of powers thing that we talked about from the French philosopher Montesquieu was taking hold among English thinkers. And then also the rule of law, the importance of the establishment of that. In fact, it was later on in the 1700s that Judge Blackstone wrote his very famous and influential treatises on English law. So, law, balance of powers, liberty, and all this kind of culminated in an emphasis among English citizens on their rights as Englishmen. Now, this is not their rights as human beings, but their rights as English people. What are their rights as English people? Basically the right to live, there's one, and to think freely, and to own property, and all those things. And this thinking is going to extend beyond people who live in England, and it's going to extend to those, English citizens, really, who live in the various English colonies around the world. Now, added to this in the early 1700s was an increasing emphasis on the idea that the British are just naturally superior, not just to non-Europeans, but even to other Europeans, basically to everybody. So the very fact of your Englishness right away really gives you kind of special status. So that special status as an English person is something that people really started to focus on, emphasize, and demand on having recognized. All right, well, now we're going to look at a couple of very important concepts that took hold in England and in the rest of Europe as well in the 18th century. These two words, both of which are no doubt familiar to you, Republicanism and Liberalism. But it's very important for you to realize that Republicanism and Liberalism, as we are discussing it here, is in an 18th century context. Those words in that context do not have the same meaning as they have in politics in the 21st century. Far from it in some cases. So those words kind of were claimed by various political factions in the U.S. in the 20th century because of their importance in the foundation of America. And they've come to have kind of specialized and specific meanings now that differ somewhat from originally. Sometimes, to distinguish between those, liberalism is called, in the context we're talking about it, sometimes people will say classical liberalism. So that's what we're talking about here. And sometimes when they're talking about republicanism, they will say small r republicanism, just like they will also sometimes say small d democratic, so as to distinguish that we're not talking about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party of the 20th and 21st century, which did not exist at this time. So the meanings behind these two words may not be exactly what you think they are in the 18th century. Okay, so now basically, to boil it down, a republic is a government that is not a monarchy, a government without a king. That's the most basic definition. However, there's a lot more to it, in this framework. So in both these things, republicanism and liberalism, there's a focus on liberty, as we just discussed, and also on the concept of inalienable rights, sometimes also called unalienable rights. Now let's break that down. If something is inalienable, that means it is not alienable. What does that mean? Well, to alienate someone means to push them away, to separate from them. And then an alien is someone that is not from your group, they're from a separate group. So if something is not alienable, what that means is it cannot be separated. It cannot be separated, in this case, from you. Your inalienable rights are also called your natural rights. And they are those human rights that everyone has, which, according to these philosophical approaches, cannot be taken away from you. They're inherent. You're born with them. And that's different from other kinds of rights, as we will see. Now, in republicanism and liberalism, there's this idea, a strong idea of the importance of property. And that's because there was this idea that owning property makes you independent, truly independent. And being truly independent means that you are less likely to be corrupted. Okay, so republicanism in particular has a strong emphasis on civic engagement and civic duty. That is, getting involved in the community in a political way, as basically not just a right, but as your duty as a citizen. All right? So this belief is that if you own property, and you are therefore more independent, you will be a more productive part of civic discourse because of your independence. What does that mean? Well, okay, if you're not a landowner, then you're a renter. And since land was so important at this time and so many people were farmers, if you're not a landowner, you're not only a renter, you're also probably not your own boss. You're probably an employee. So, when it comes time to participate in community politics, and that's something that is done by voting, according to this way of looking at things, if you're a renter or an employee, your judgment can't completely be trusted because you might be afraid to vote for what you really think is right because you might be afraid that would offend your landlord or your boss and lose you, your home or your job. So therefore, you're more likely to vote however your landlord or boss wants you to. And so that doesn't make you a productive citizen. So that's what that's all about. And as we will see, this emphasis on property is going to be a big, big part of the establishment of the United States of America. Now, another thing that Republicanism does, in addition to this very strong emphasis on civic duty, is that it stresses an activist government. What does that mean? An activist government is a government that gets directly involved. Okay? So the opposite of that is a government that kind of stands back. Republicanism calls for the government to take action for the benefit of the citizenry to, quote, promote the general welfare, to do what is best for the greater number of people, not necessarily for certain individuals. And there already, if you're familiar with the modern day 21st century viewpoints on what republicanism and liberalism is, you'll see that the Republican Party today, end of the 20th century, is the opposite of something that asks for an activist government. They look for less government. So this is where that doesn't conflate with the original word. So the republic is basically republicanism, this idea that the community all functions together when everyone plays their part and everyone puts the well-being of the community at large and of the largest number of people ahead of the well-being of any individual, and that the government that is put in place makes sure that that happens. Well, if republicanism is about promoting the general welfare and about the community, liberalism is kind of the opposite of that. Liberalism is a focus on the freedom of the individual. So in Enlightenment philosophy, particularly Enlightenment political philosophy, republicanism and liberalism, they go hand in hand, but they kind of represent opposite sides of the coin, and there is a pushing of one against the other that results in a balance between the two. The greater good of the public and the freedom of the individual. Liberalism, classical liberalism, often the philosopher John Locke is called the father of liberalism, and a lot of the ideas associated with it were articulated by him, either originated by him or in some cases originated elsewhere and more eloquently articulated by him. Locke talked about the social contract, and that is a description of what government is. That government is a mutual agreement among equals, and that power comes from the consent of the governed, not from a supernatural source. Now, the divine right of kings from the medieval era that asserted that power comes from God. God made somebody king, otherwise they wouldn't be king, so you have to obey them, so that's that. Liberalism says, or rather the social contract says, it is the consent of the governed. What does that mean? So let me break that down and explain it in layman's terms. So, what is a community? A community is a group of people who live in proximity, close proximity to one another, who decide to act in unison. Now, in a community throughout human history, as nomadic bands grew into organized forms of governments, here's how it works. You got a group of people, and they have needs that have to be met. Government is what happens when the overall group of people decide to select an individual or some individuals to make sure that those needs are met. And they make them, therefore, the government. Okay? To make sure the needs are met. What are the needs? The biggest needs are the public defense and the general welfare. So, got a community, somebody needs to take charge and organize things to make sure that that community can be defended against outside invaders, and organized to make sure that within the community everything is running smoothly in such a way that it's going to benefit everybody. Okay? So the members of the community pick some people to do that, to do this administrative stuff. Now, unlike the concept of the divine right of kings, that government then does not just automatically have absolute power to do whatever they want to do, no matter what, because they're in power. No, they're in power because they're in a contract with the community, with the people. And here's the contract, okay? We, the people, are going to give you power. We're going to make you the government and ask you to protect us and make sure things are running smoothly. And in return for that, to make that easier for you, we agree to do what you say up to a point. We agree to surrender some of our rights. Okay? Now, what kind of rights are we talking about? Well, the community is not agreeing to surrender their natural rights, their human rights, because, remember, those are inalienable. They can't be taken away from you. They mustn't be taken away from you. So no one's going to give those up. And those are the rights of, for example, family relationships. Who your family is, who you're going to marry, for example, what your religion is, how you conduct, not how you conduct, but what business you conduct, the ability to conduct business, the ability to own property, the ability to think, the ability to have an opinion. You're not giving up any of that. Those are inalienable. Instead, you're giving up lesser rights. Okay? So, in order for the government to be able to function, in order for these people you've chosen to go into this contract with, to give them power, you agree to do what they say, as long as they don't try to take away those basic human rights of yours. So what does that mean? How does that translate? Well, here's a good example. Speed limits. We all agree to conform to what the government that we selected decides to mandate so far as how fast we can drive. And they decide that. The reason that they even make such a decision is to make sure that it's safe for everybody. So we agree as a people, as a community, to let them do that. We give up our right to just decide how fast to go. And then we acknowledge that if we break that rule, then we can be punished in some way. That's not the same thing as agreeing to let the government tell you what religion you have to be. We don't do that. But we do say, okay, you can tell us how fast to go. You can decide what taxes to levy under the right circumstances. You can decide what regulations for zoning codes, building codes and stuff, all that stuff. We agree to let you do. And in return, as the government, you agree, do the best that you can out of a sense of civic responsibility, because Republicanism, and not try to take away our inalienable natural human rights. If the government does that, according to liberalism, according to John Locke, if this government that is put in place winds up trying to take away your human rights, your right to choose your religion, your right of what to say and what to think, if the government tries to do that, they don't have a right to do that because that's not in the contract. They are violating the contract if they do that. And since they violated the contract, the people then have the right to terminate that contract and renegotiate and make a contract with somebody else instead. Which means that, on a normal day, there is the right to, all that is exercised through voting. But if voting is not an option, if voting is not allowed, if the people's voice is not heard, then because the social contract has been violated, there is the right of rebellion. The people have the right to physically, forcibly fight back and overthrow that government that is taking away their human rights, because they violated the contract. Okay, so looking at it that way, you see that both the governed and the governor, or the government, have certain responsibilities and have certain duties they each are supposed to fulfill. And they both agree to fulfill those. And if they don't, then there are consequences. But this does not conform to the idea that the very act of having a government is evil and wrong. This conforms rather to the idea that a government is necessary because someone has to take charge and make those decisions that are entrusted to them via this contract by their fellow citizens, and which can be taken away if abused. Okay. So among these, as I mentioned, is the right to property, and property is very, very much emphasized in Enlightenment thinking, in Republicanism and Liberalism. In fact, Locke said that the government exists to protect life, liberty, and property, all of which are natural rights. So, in the 1700s, in the English colonies in particular, where Locke's thinking was very influential, each colony had a legislature made up of elected officials who lived there in that colony, even though the colony was ruled by Great Britain. It was ruled by Parliament and the king. But on a local level in the colony, they had their own legislature. Okay, and then getting more to an even more local level, each town would have its town council. That would be people who were elected, who live in the town, to serve on that council. In colonial America in the 1700s, in order to serve in the state legislature, or the colonial legislature, or usually in town councils, you had to own a certain amount of property. And if you didn't own property, you didn't get to participate because you were not deemed to be independent enough to be incorruptible. So you were suspect. So that's something That is no longer the case in 21st century United States of America. But it was the case in the colonies, and it was also the case when those colonies became states for actually a good long while before change was made, and basically working class and poor people were eventually allowed, if they were white and male, were eventually allowed to participate in government. But according to the basic tenets of these Enlightenment philosophies, they would not have been. Now, occasionally, lately, and by lately this is 2020, so in the last several years, I've sometimes heard people call for a return to this way of doing things, that you shouldn't be allowed to be able to vote unless you owned a certain amount of property or had a certain amount of money. That would be a huge step backwards. This is the weak link, really, of liberalism and republicanism as originally envisioned and articulated. And, there's a reason that later that got changed. All right. Well, this sets up the way that many colonists were thinking by the mid-1700s, particularly the ones who were well-read or the ones who had a university education, who were among the political and financial elite. So this is where they got some of these ideas. These are the types of ideas they were starting to develop that we're going to see come into play in a very, very big way. But first, we're going to talk about another phenomenon in the 1700s that was a reaction against the Enlightenment.